Welcome back to Physio Discussed, the Physio Network podcast where we explore the clinical topics that shape modern physiotherapy practice. In today's episode, we're diving into physiotherapy approaches to youth athletes, an area where growth, development and training demands create very different challenges to that of the adult world. I'm joined by two exceptional guests, Angela Jackson and Daniel Elias, both highly experienced clinicians and educators in paediatric and adolescent sport. Their work focuses on helping physiotherapists better understand how growth and maturation influence injury risk, performance, and clinical decision-making in young athletes. This really is a must-listen for anyone working with young athletes. So let's get into it. I'm James Armstrong, and this is Physio Discussed. Angela, Dan, great to have you both on the Physio Discussed podcast where we have a little bit more time to chat and an interesting topic that we need to chat about today. So both of you, thank you so much for your time.
It's okay. Very happy to be here and to chat with you and Angie. Always a great conversation.
Thank you very much indeed for the invite, and we're looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's going to be great. We've chatted to you both independently. Angie, I've spoken to you, I think, quite a few times now, actually. Yeah. And Dan, we recorded an episode of the Physio Explained podcast recently, and I think we've established that there's more to talk about, and who better to get on and bring you both together to have this discussion. And we're going to be talking generally around how, as physiotherapists and clinicians, we approach our youngsters, so our adolescents, our kids, lots of terminology, but we'll kind of cover that a little bit about what age groups we might be looking at. But let's kick off in terms of what do we want to be aware of. Angie, I'm going to come to you first. In terms of why do we need to have this conversation? Why are we, the three of us, sitting here talking about kids, adolescents, youngsters, rather than just bunching them into smaller adults?
Yeah, it's a great way to start. I think one of my kind of real sort of passions is trying to highlight just how different children are in terms of their anatomy, in terms of growth tissue, but that brings with it a different spectrum of pathologies. And what we're aware of is that at undergraduate level, certainly in the UK, these sorts of things are rarely taught across physios, across sports rehab courses. And so it's very easy for a clinician to qualify and think that they've got some tools in the kit bag that they can just either dilute or adapt to our younger person. And what we're really aware of is that skeletal maturation, brain maturation don't actually complete until well into the 20s. So when we're talking about this adolescence, we ought to be extending that to almost thinking about this growth tissue being a potential site of injury between maybe the ages of around 8 and 23.
So quite a wide age group there. And I'm sure lots of listeners are starting to think, well, actually, that is a big age group, and we're actually talking into our 20s. Dan, anything more on that in terms of why we're having this conversation, and to add on to anything there Angie said?
No, I think that's a great starting point from Angie. I think it's the difference between the chronological age and the skeletal maturation age, which we can go into in a bit and discuss how we calculate that and how we know. But it's really important that you look beyond the date of birth of a child that comes in. So you need to work out, because you can have a 13-year-old who can have a skeleton of a 10 or a 9-year-old, or of a 17, 18-year-old. So it can sometimes be fairly obvious when you look at them and they look, that really, really tall child. When you used to play football when you were younger and you thought that you had an adult playing on your team, and that still happens in sport now. And I think that it's just getting the clinician to know what skeletal ways they're dealing with, because as Angie said, the diagnosis will differ physically, but also from a cognitive point of view about their understanding and their sort of their emotional control, which can be perturbed during these years as well. So I think it's a really good foundation to start from, and then the rest of it flows well.
So we're really talking not just necessarily a physical and physiology element to it, but also a psychological and cognitive element at all, which is something that we need to take into account. during these fundamental years of this kind of patient group. So I suppose the next question really would be, how do you've mentioned their skeletal age. What sort of tools can clinicians use to start thinking about the person in front of them that may be aged 14 or 15 or any age, to try and think about how they might approach them based on their skeletal age? Is there other tools we can use? How can we go about that?
So there are several different methodologies for assessing how mature the skeleton is, as opposed to the date of birth that you see on the referral form. And one of the traditional ways that was done was by x-raying the wrists of particularly young athletes in football clubs. And then it kind of had a bit of an ethical consideration, and it was kind of not an approach that could be used widely. So it's sort of been replaced by other different calculations. So if we do the skeletal age, it enables us to look and compare to the norms, and either judge somebody to be ahead or behind. And then we can look in terms of the maturation of things like breast development, and they can do a self-examination, but that obviously comes with it. It's slightly embarrassing for the child to talk about some of their sort of puberty type related changes. So what's emerged is one of the more common ones I use is based on something called the Khamis-Roche, Khamis, and then Roche, Khamis-Roche. And certainly Sean Cummings, who works out of Bath University and is one of the leads in growth and maturation, has made available a little widget on his website. If you put into the website, I put Bath University and Sean Cummings and sporting stars, those sorts of words, and you'll get to a page which halfway down is a widget. And what you need is the mum's height, the dad's height, the kid's height, and the kid's current weight. And it then sort of predicts how tall the child is going to be based on those different factors. You can't use the site once you're over 16, but it's brilliant because what it does is say, well, let's say little Johnny at the moment is 160 centimetres, but he's going to be 180 centimetres. And from that, we can work out what percentage of his predicted height he is at the moment. And what we know is about 92 to 93% of that predicted adult height is when they're going to be in the middle of their big growth spurt. So the growth spurt generally starts at around 88%, finishes at about 95, 96. But the peak growth period that we see in a lot of kids that look like they're all legs and they've just suddenly shot up, invariably occurs around that sort of 92 to 93%. And there's various, there's one on Science for Sport, there's one that Jamie Salter's got, that are free downloads that you can use as a spreadsheet. And I just have one open on my desktop, and then I can quickly put it in and it just calculates that data for you. I don't know, Dan, have you got any other tools in the kit bag you add to that?
No, that's the one. So I use Jamie Salter's one. I've used that for quite a few years, and it's absolutely invaluable because, as I said, I'm just saying about the percentages of where they're at in their peak adult height. So if I know that, and it helps with monitoring. So if I know a kid comes in and say they're about 88, 89, I know they're very rapidly going to hit their peak height velocity, which from the research I found tends to kick off around 90 to 91%. So I can put strategies in place to know that for the next couple of years, 2, 3 years, there's going to be quite fast leg velocity. So the tempo can go quite fast. So during these years, what strategies can we put into place before they might get injured? So knowing those percentages is crucial. And also it follows the growth of the body as well. So, and if they've, say, example, they've got a spinal issue, they're a cricketer or they're a football, any extension-based sports, and they are, say, 95 to 96% of their growth, we know that that's where the legs have slowed down a bit, but the spine's starting to grow at a slightly slower pace. But during these years of growth of the growth plates and the physes, they become temporarily porous, so they can't tolerate so much lows. So we then need to adapt potentially the training and aspects like that. So that percentage is crucial in being able to manage these young athletes well.
I think one of the important things there is that, as Dan said, growth occurs from the foot up towards the pelvis and the spine. So from a distal to proximal direction. And what we know is that when we're seeing growth, then the growth plates in that region are more active. So we tend to see that as the foot's starting to kick off in those high 80s, early 90s percentage of predicted adult height, we're more seeing those injuries at the growth plate around the calcaneum or the fifth metatarsal. And then as we move upwards, we're starting to see the knee beginning to grow as the tibia and the femur grow. And they're at a different percentage of predicted adult height. And then, as Dan said, once we get up to the spine, we're more seeing them coming out of that big growth spurt. And we start to see more injuries around the lumbar spine. So what's important is when we start to try and make a diagnosis in these kids, if we've got that child of, say, let's say 14, 15, and we can see that he's an average maturer, so he's doing everything we'd expect him to do, then the probability of him still having growth in the or an injury at the foot growth plates becomes very unlikely. So it's a way in which we can say, well, yes, it's always really good from an injury prevention and a training, but it also helps us to, with our differential diagnosis, our clinical reasoning. If we already know that the growth plates in that foot have probably closed by a child who's maybe 93, 94, 95%, then we can't be looking at a growth related injury in one of those foot structures. And we maybe need to look at a bone stress injury or something that we might see more in the adult population. So understanding that distal to proximal growth actually coincides with the opening and the closures of all the growth plates is the same direction can really help us tie in our diagnosis.
That's brilliant. I think that's really useful, and I think what's really nice is we're starting already to talk about percentages rather than ages, which
Yeah.
seems to be a far
Yeah.
more accurate and useful number to be thinking about. I just want to draw it back a little bit. We've mentioned a few terms there which listeners might not be so familiar with, and I thought if we could just maybe just highlight, elaborate on those. So we talk about peak height and weight velocity. So we're talking about a velocity which many listeners will recognize to do with in acceleration and speed. Just talk us through those couple of terms there and the terms we've been using, if that's all right.
Okay with it, Dan? You're good on this one?
Yeah, so the peak height velocity is in essence is fast growth, and it's incredibly fast in the legs, and it can range for about 7 to 12 centimeters a year. It can start at different times in boys and girls. So girls tend to enter that fast peak height velocity phase earlier than the boys do. Girls on average around about 12, boys can be a little bit later at 13 to 14. But this can vary. I suppose we can go into that. You can have an early maturer who can kick off really, really early, and then also a late maturer. So you have on time and late as well. So that's that peak height velocity phase. And the peak weight velocity tends to occur about 6 months after they've sort of finished the peak height velocity. So that's worth considering, because you think, oh, they've gone through their fast velocity of growth, and then a little bit down the line, their weight tends to increase. So this can then have, both of those can have a real impact on the inertia that's going through the joints and their movement control. So if you know these and this all comes back again to tracking the percentage of the peak adult height, because if you know where they're at, if they're coming towards the end of this velocity phase, you can then start building and educating the parents that, if, say, for example, 5, 6 months time, they're like, oh, he's losing a bit of speed, or he's a bit more uncontrolled, or he hasn't got the power to push off again. And we know that if they're putting on extra mass, have they got the muscle control, the neuromuscular to be able to control that new body that they're going through as well? So I think they're quite important terms. And also there's also the peak muscle velocity as well. Now, interestingly, this is quite a way behind the bone. So the tibial growth in the bone, the growth of the muscles around that region could be up to 1.5 to 2 years behind that bone growth. So you've got this longer bone, but you haven't quite got the muscle that can control this increased length as well. So I think this is all sort of tied into during these years. Um, Children might not be moving as effectively. Their movement errors are quite big, but this is all because they're getting used to these growths of these limbs. So I think these are the sort of years that I just feel passionately about, that we're working on this neuromuscular control, balance, visual tracking, trunk control, really using our imagination to challenge these children during these growth years. And then there's the risk of when they tend to do quite high volumes of sport, and if it's lots of rapid change of direction, there's a risk during these years of these having these type of injuries. I think they're avoidable, but I suppose that's what me and Angie are quite passionate about, how we get the education in before these children get broken as well.
I think there's another aspect to it as well, which I find quite interesting, because I see a lot of girls around that puberty age. And what happens is that we get this big surge in height, and we get that less in the girls than the boys. The boys is a bit more dramatic, often fueled by testosterone. So the boys basically get to quite rapidly, as Dan said, around 6 months after the big growth spurt, this peak mass or peak weight velocity kicks in, and the boys seem to be able to convert that more readily to power and strength. So they're things like their counter movement jump, their vertical jump rapidly goes up by about 10 centimeters over the course of a year. What happens is with the girls is it's delayed, it's not as quick as 6 months, and they tend to have way more of a sort of fat-free mass gain, and they can't convert that into power. So you don't see those same surges in counter movement jump, for example. And a lot of parents can mistakenly at this point, if it's not explained to them clearly, misunderstand that the child's perhaps getting a little bit overweight. And so insensitive remarks can come out from coaches and from parents, perhaps just not realizing the impact of the words that they're saying. And I spend a lot of time normalizing it, saying you're going through a massive growth spurt at the moment, but you're going to end up experiencing quite a big gain in weight at the moment, or maybe you're currently experiencing that. And it's perfectly normal. We want that to happen. That's the only way in which we get really good skeletal development. So please don't worry about it. It's the normal part, and we just need to ride it. And it's the thing that we need to kick on with the next phase of development. So I think it's really important that we empower parents to understand that these are all normal phases, that kids who've previously been flying in their sport, and we call it adolescent awkwardness, suddenly, you know, the top kid in the class, and he was so easy and everything was coming to him, success was early, and then suddenly, boom, he ends up in this phase where he's all arms and legs and his coordination's gone. That can have a massive impact on self-esteem. And some of these parents then go, well, I don't know what's happening. He's slow and he's this and he's that. And the poor kid's standing there going, but I'm trying really hard. So I think it's a real privilege as a clinician to be able to explain these very normal physiological processes in terms of the highs and lows that we see.
That's fascinating, and the thing that strikes me the most is it's wonderful that we're giving this knowledge today to all our listeners, many of whom are clinicians. But I'm just thinking of all of the coaching teams and the sports teams that really need this information that I've seen probably on a weekly basis that do not get that and haven't got that, and just like you said there, Angie, some of the words can be powerful and very negatively impactful without that understanding.
Yeah,
So
indeed.
the other thing I wanted to ask as well is you talked about the peak weight velocity. Do we know much about what that is in terms of composition? Are we seeing lean muscle mass gain? Are we seeing sort of fat cell gain? Do we know more about that at all?
Do you want to answer
Um,
that, Dan?
yeah, so as Andy says, so when the girls tend to put on a bit more fat mass, and the boys tend to put on a bit more fat-free mass during these years. And interestingly, there's the way the cells are generated in the joints of the body. Boys can just naturally, their shoulders will naturally grow through maturation, and the girls' hips will naturally grow during those years as well. But so I think that with regards to those changes, this is where the getting the strength phase at the right time is really important. So and that's why I'm quite passionate with doing that with girls as well. There's all the talk about the ACL injuries that are going up, and I think the things this is where this all needs to be built. Sometimes people talk about the type of shoe or are they strong enough and different things, but during these years where these growth changes are happening, and they're normal changes, like Angie said, but if we know that a girl's going through that puberty phase and we know that the peak weight velocity is coming and they're losing that absolute strength, what can we do in those years to start the right type of resistance training during those years to build up the strength, and that improves movement control. Um, and I think that sometimes that's lacking quite a lot on what I see in the girls that are coming through, is that they're still, especially it's quite common in private schools, they're doing a huge amount of volume of sport. And when I'm seeing these ACL injuries or these bucket handle meniscal tears in these quite young children, and I think a lot of it, when you look at the move and you look at a really simple single leg squat, or you look at the way they land from a jump, they haven't got any of these the strength or the movement to be able to tolerate these high forces. So if you link that in with the lack of strength that's happening, it's a bit of a recipe that we need to try and deal with.
And I can imagine that this is quite often taking place during the years whereby there's even more pressure to succeed and to make teams to be picked at that level, especially when we talked about sort of some of the private schools where they are looking at scholarships abroad and things like that, and that could be a real cauldron of things coming together which don't go well, where they're being pushed even harder at the stage where they might need more specific intervention.
I think there's often not enough time in the week for them to be able to put in the sort of movement control and strength and conditioning that perhaps they need. And one of the things that, in fact, I said in clinic tonight was saying to this young man who's in the middle of his growth spurt and he's just had a hip injury. And I said to him at the time, you're reaching that point now in your development where you can't just play sport. You're going to have to train to play the sport. And I said, in your week, we're going to have to allocate time now for you to be able to maintain the sort of mobility and maintain all these movements that we're doing and get your strength up. This isn't something you can just do because you're injured. You're going to have to maintain this momentum throughout your training if you want to actually stay injury free and succeed. And this kid's not an elite athlete by any stretch of the imagination. He's a normal young man that plays 2 or 3 different sports, but he began to realize that that elongation of the trunk had left him somewhat weak around the middle. And the imbalances that were emerging needed to be addressed if we were going to start to make him be able to get back to sport and stay back.
So it leads us really nicely actually onto sort of what we can do. So we're thinking the listeners that are listening to this during this period of growth to mitigate injury. So we talked about some of this in terms of neuromuscular rehab, load management, and also fueling during growth and sleep. So there's a few things there to consider, but I want to kind of really focus on what you think listeners can take away most of all during this phase when they've got that youngster sitting in front of them. What are your thoughts and what are your tips?
I think for me, it's about seizing that opportunity to educate every young person you come into contact with, or every coach you come into contact with, their parents. I think on the whole, Dan and I have both experienced parents who are a little bit overzealous, but on the whole, most parents are just completely unaware as to how they can boost the capacity to do more. So I think we need to really kind of start to empower parents to understand what load management looks like, how perhaps they can start to track load so that they understand where in the year that the biggest sort of density of either fixtures or the highest intensity periods are going to be, and try and show parents that they need to get the kid ready for that and not arrive at the national championships absolutely exhausted, and start to help them to kind of use a big wall planner and start to think, or a spreadsheet where they can start to see the hot spots in the year, and how, but that we don't need them to avoid those. We needed them to prepare and train for them 6 and 8 weeks ahead of those busy periods. so that the child can tolerate it. And I'm always keen to help parents understand that we're in the business of athlete development and not athlete restriction. So we're not trying to tell kids to do less. We're trying to tell them to plan better, plan in the week periods of time where they can do strength, plan in the week time to just have fun, to be kids, and to actually have that recovery and adaptation time. So I think all too often we see that kids are playing 2 and 3 sports a day, and they're not fueling for, twice as much activity as their parents. They're eating those 3 meals a day, and yet they probably need 5. They've got little tummies, and they're doing twice as much activity as the rest of us. So are they taking all of these extra recovery time, extra meals into account, and starting to be a bit more proactive in the planning phase? I don't know what you think, Dan.
Yeah, so I think trying to make sure we've got the fundamentals right, especially with the kids and the parents. So interestingly, I see like at my clinic, I see in Bath, I see a pattern of injuries during the year. So it commonly occurs quite busy around September to November. So kids generally in the summer will back off mainly from their sports if they're not in a summer sport. So they'll deload quite significantly. Now, it doesn't mean that they have to do nothing in the summer, but they need to keep things going. Then what happens when they go out to the school term is all of a sudden, boom, they're back into a significant amount of volume in the week, and their bodies haven't adapted to it. So there's that period there. So as Angie said, if we can educate parents that what can they do over the summer, and also the other risk times is whenever they come back off half terms, it's the same thing again. They have 2 or 3 weeks off. They significantly deload and don't do enough, and they rapidly build up again. So that's a really easy way to try and plan in advance and how you keep things organized. My other top tip is sleep. So it's really basic, but it's really probably done. So, for the early children, you're looking at least sort of 10 to 12 hours a night. When they get into later adolescence, their body clock will change a little bit, less release of melatonin, so about 8 to 10 hours. The risk comes in when you've got children that maybe play sports later on in the evening, or they go to bed later, and then they have early starts. So then that might be they have an early they might be a swimmer, so they have early swimming sessions. So then they become into what we call sleep debt. So this has big impact on growth. It can have a big impact on how their cognition works. If you think about a child going into a match, they have to make a decision, they're lacking sleep, it can then potentially lead to poor movements on the field. So planning, sleep are really important. Andy's touched on nutrition. It's such a big area, but I think it's commonly missed. And even when they're going through their really fast velocity phases, when they're sitting there at rest, their body is growing. So they're using energy when they're sitting there. When they're at school, they're working hard, they're using their brain. The brain is a muscle. That's also taking energy. So if you're then got loads of sport in the week on top of that, are they adequately fueled? Is their car half full of petrol? Is it a quarter full of petrol? Or is it full of petrol? So it's just not going to be able to tolerate that. And I think there's some of the really basic areas. And if you get that stuff right, then we can then go on to, okay, how are you landing from a jump? How are you changing direction? What are your muscle markers? We look at handheld dynamometry in the right age group. So, but I think it's commonly done the wrong way around. All the fundamentals are missed, and then we're just putting even more stuff on their plate, and they can't quite tolerate it.
I think one of the things I'll often say to kids is, and I use this all the time in clinic, is that they're a little bit like a mobile phone. And many of the sort of vital functions that the phone does overnight, like backing all the stuff up that they've learnt in the day to the hard drive and checking for viruses, but also explaining to them that we actually lay down more bone at night. The impact of the gym work they've done in the day, we're actually gaining strength at night. So if actually we could just get a little bit more regular bedtimes, and it's called sleep pressure. We need them to get into consistent habits so that we're able to sort of create the same sort of bedtime each night, same wake time. And that's often really hard, as Dan said, with a lot of these youngsters and training times. But I think it's also really, really important that we start to highlight the impact that probably 25% of the kids I see don't have breakfast. So if we're going to try and meet our nutritional needs, I often say it's a bit like the phone in power saving mode. It will power down certain non-essential functions if we're running out of juice on the mobile phone, and they are kind of the same. So in those periods of low energy availability, the body looks round and goes, well, do I need reproduction? Do I need immunity? Do I need sort of digestion? And so it starts to power down sort of thyroxine. It has an impact on estrogen and testosterone. And with that, what it does is changes that osteoblast, osteoclast activity in the bone, and we start to get stress fractures. So I think just showing, I kind of think about fueling the training battery and fueling the essential life battery, and they can't borrow from each other. So we need them to start to think about an extra 2 units of sport needs an extra 2 units of food or two more food intakes. And that really helps them to start to see how this works. So I think more than anything, I have kids who are bulletproof strong, they move beautifully, but if they don't eat enough for what they do and they don't factor in recovery, adaptation and sleep, then they still get these injuries.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
what I'd want to just build on from that, just a bit of a clinical scenario that I came into once, and I learned a valuable lesson that with both male and females, chosen at the right time if you're suspicious, but also asking about their eating habits and if they've had any problems with eating in the past, because that can have a real impact on their bone densities. So if you're looking at that later adolescent, um, or even when they get into their 20s, I commonly, one of my questions I tend to ask, I suppose good for listeners, I just say, how many meals do you have a day? That's my start. So I know then if I say two, I'm like, oh, which one don't you have? And it doesn't put any pressure on the question of it as well. And then I might go, if the parents in there as well, is there any eating issues in the past? And sometimes it comes out they've had like an eating disorder in the past. And if that's happening during the years where they're putting down loads of their bone density, again, it raises that flag a little bit that, okay, if all the other pieces are lining here for maybe a bone stress injury or aspects of growth. So I think that's a nice way for, I suppose, for listeners to go into broaching the question of nutrition, I think.
Mm.
I think we've got to make sure we're not judgmental, because what
Mm.
we're trying to do is open that dialogue. And I think Dan's right in the way that we've got to phrase those questions. And I think importantly, though, that we've got the group that maybe have disordered eating and they're very aware of calories or food groups and they're restricting things, or we might have eating disorders. But I think for me, that in the kids group, there's this massive, what we'd call unintentional underfueling. And that's just being blissfully unaware of, if, say, for example, we haven't really talked about the intensity that the child works at. So let's say we've got a kid who's maybe a year or 2 years, because you can get a child who's maybe 3 years behind or 3 years ahead playing against each other in the same school fixture. So suddenly we've got a 10-year-old via 16-year-old in the under 13s. Now imagine being that 10-year-old, and they may be small, they may not, but they're certainly going to be in a very different developmental place to the 16-year-old. Once you start to explain this, some of those smaller kids or those later development kids will start to kind of, it feels a bit, they feel relieved to understand this process.
Yeah.
And then you start to have the conversation around, well, does that mean that when you're working against these bigger kids, you're probably working absolutely flat out? For them, they might be cruising in a PE lesson, but you're working at close to your limits every time you step on a field. And we may be having kids who parents are saying, go hard or go home, or coaches coming out with stupid comments, and even the inadvertent comment of try your best. Well, to some kids, that's 100%. Work hard. We think of it as a soft comment, but what we're driving is these kids to think that you can work at 100% effort.
Yeah.
And we all know that if you drive the car in first gear, you burn through more fuel than fifth. So a lot of these kids are just not even aware of how much they need. And so that's very unintentional. It's not looking for just the disordered eating. It's very much just blissfully unaware of what you need.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really, really interesting area, and one that we do see covered and is important in adults as well. But it's having those conversations that could potentially be a little bit harder as well when you've got youngsters. And then the other thing that I don't know if I'm right in thinking as well is, whilst we're fueling for the sport, we've also got a person sitting in front of us that's having to fuel for their their growth. So I'm just likening it to someone who's rehabbing after an injury or an operation. We know that their calorie need is much greater due to that injury, due to that post-surgical recovery on top of the rehab that we're giving. So I'm thinking of it in that respect. I don't know if that's correct to do so, but these kids need the fuel to grow as well as their basic metabolic rate, and then on top of the sport that they're playing. So it's quite a lot.
Yeah, I think you're right there, James. Especially like if I seeing quite a lot of post-op ACLs in the young age group, and um, it's really important, like you said, about the fact that they're still growing bodies. You know, their muscles, their bones, their ligaments, they're all still changing. So it doesn't just mean because they had the operation that bish bash bosh, it's all done, and you follow that, that ACL rehab journey. With the kid, you've got the extra aspects of, like you said, they are still growing, and that that those phases. So that's why I really come back all the way back to the start about using the percentage of their peak height, because if you've got an ACL injury in a 13-year-old, where is their skeletal maturity? So I liaise quite closely with consultants when I'm working as well, and obviously when they go in the operation to see if their physes are open or if they're closed. And if we build that into that picture, it really does impact on how I design my rehab program as well, because it's just not paint by numbers. It's not, oh, here's a 15-year-old, I'm going to use exactly the same rehab program that I use in all my kids. So there has to be a bespoke element to it. Yeah, you've got your fundamental stuff, but I think this sort of the growth stuff, it bleeds into all the rehab that we do.
So I think one of the things we haven't really talked about too much, and I think is really relevant there, because Dan just mentioned the open physes. So what we just need to think about is when a child is born, their skeleton is largely cartilaginous. And over time at the physis, which is the growth plate, everything in pediatric medicine, unfortunately, has about 3 names and they're all the same structure. But if we think of the growth plate, physis, physeal growth plate, it's got lots of names, but it's where this process of being cartilaginous and then replaced by bone over time. Now, what we said is that growth starts in the foot. So the growth of the foot bones is active in those earlier children, usually finishing around the ages of sort of 11, 12, 13, depending on maturation. Girls always 2 years earlier. So what we've got to understand is that each bone has its own what we call timing of ossification. It goes from being cartilage to bone. And injuries can only occur at those growth tissues when it's open for business. I always say it's a bit like a shop. You can't shop when it's closed, and that's the same as injuries occurring in the growth tissues. So we need to understand these timing of ossification, because it can implicate when or whether we should do surgery. It's important to understand that it's a very weak structure. It's way more fragile while it's getting its sort of this process occurring. And so we see lots of injuries that just don't occur in the adult. So understanding the timing that each individual bone is going to be available for injury, and then when it closes, so that we know we've got to look for other diagnoses, is hugely important. And we don't learn this at university. And certainly on my Kids Back to Sport website, we have a free download for all clinicians. They're welcome to look at that. And it goes into all of these terminologies around growth and maturation, but it also, there's an additional one on timing of ossification, because we do need to understand those if we want to make a diagnosis. Without it, we don't know whether the injury is at the growth tissue or within the tendon.
I see that that ossification is so important. So think of that clinical scenario. So I'm seeing quite a lot of, I don't know if you are, Angie, I'm seeing quite a lot of these mid-adolescents really getting into weight training at the moment. I mean, there's bigger better things to be hooked on, but yeah, doing lots of heavy lifting, lots of bench press, lots of dipping. And they come in and they're like, oh, with a parent, I've got a rotator cuff problem, and they're like 15 or 14. And we know that the acromioclavicular joint, the sternoclavicular joint, I mean, as Angie said, they can go into their 20s before they fuse. So when you know that, you're then dealing with a completely different diagnosis in this population, and it can be misdiagnosed quite easily because you'll see this person in front of you who looks fully mature, but knowing when those areas are going to close, those growth plates, really helps with the management of these children.
So I think one of the things that we've got to do is upskill the sort of new learner, the new graduates, to being aware of these differences between adults and children in terms of this anatomy that is very different, that comes with this spectrum of pathology, understanding whether the child is on time maturation or late or early, because that again blends with whether we're getting these accurate diagnoses. And quite often clinicians say to me, gosh, all that's going to take quite a lot of time. And I'd encourage them to just have the ossification timings either laminated or on their laptops, so they can just, they don't have to learn them, they just have to refer to them. And this makes it so much easier. And you don't have to work out the percentage of adult height. Once you start working with kids, you look like, well, the foot's clearly growing because we just asked mum if the kid's going through sizes and, multiple sizes of shoes. And when we want to know if the legs are growing, you can see their trousers are halfway up their shins. And you can again ask if they are finding it hard to keep the kid in clothes. So there's lots of softer questions you can ask without having to get into the science every single time of working out all these different things. And how I get round it though is I'll send out a pre-assessment questionnaire, and it has on it all of these things. Could you measure your height, dad's height, the kid's height, and so on, and all about their weekly load? Because otherwise you kind of get to this and you think, gosh, that's a lot of information in a half-hour appointment. So using a really good template, number one, saves you time, but number two, it gets everybody on the same page. We want to know if the child's had an eating disorder. We want to know if they've got menstrual regularity, or perhaps there's a family history of Crohn's or celiac. So just sending out a questionnaire with all of the topics Dan and I have covered. Do you feel tired during the day, or do you feel like you get enough sleep? Do you get hungry during the day? All of these non-leading questions that help us to build a picture before the child walks in can be such an advantage, such a time saver, but also just empower parents to realize what information is important.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Great tool to save time, especially if anyone here is working in a busy NHS environment, then the time is of the essence, and that can definitely help. It's a bit of a service improvement project there. Anything more to add on that one, Dan?
No, I think yeah, that Andrew makes a point. The more information you can get from the parents, the better. So when I'm at the clinic I work at in London, we have like as what Andy said, I get them to do all the measurements before they come in. So I've already calculated that skeletal maturation before they come in, so I've got a good idea, as opposed to sitting in the session trying to get it out from them. It just takes too long as well. But it can get quite overwhelming, and we do cover a lot. And I think 'cause we've been working with children, Andy, longer than me, but for quite a period of time, and you tend to start developing pattern recognition. When you all start off as a physio, and there's so much information, but you start to get, if you've got like a pro forma, or you've got like a crib sheet where you're starting to watch out for this sort of stuff, and it slowly starts to make sense. If someone walks in and they look like a giraffe, like they've got those really long legs and the short upper body, you start to build a picture and put all the pieces together. But I think, yeah, we just starting with the basics, and then upskilling with education. And then it does get a lot easier, and you sort of develop that rhythm with it as well. But I think what we're trying to hit home here is there is a real difference between, like you said at the start, between adults and children. And I think sometimes people are a bit blasé about, there's not much difference to them. Diagnoses are fairly similar. And I think it's not trying to scare people, but just to try and to show the patterns that we go through.
Yeah, brilliant. As we said before we started this podcast, time is flying by. But I do want to finish with a couple of other bits, particularly around busting some myths, which Andy put on our pre-recording notes. And I do hope listeners have been taking notes, because we've covered so much today. This could definitely be an episode that people have to listen to more than once, which is great. So let's address some of the myths. What sort of things? Let's go with a couple from each of you, maybe, or we'll haven't got a huge amount of time. So, but some of the key things that you hear maybe on a regular basis that you think is really important that we address today and maybe dispel today. Angie, I'm going to start with you because I think you put it in our back and forth
Yeah.
email. So let's start with you.
Okay, so I think one of the things is kids shouldn't start, for example, resistance training until they've gone through puberty, or kids shouldn't do weight training. And I think, number one, we've established through this podcast that if we were to say tag an age to that, what would we choose? Because that 13-year-old may still have the body of a 10-year-old or the body of a 16-year-old. So you can't use age to quantify whether a child can do weight training. Equally, there was the myth that we used to say that if a child was 12, then they could do 12 hours of formalized sport a week. If they were 13, they could do 13 hours. And you can't get more ambiguous advice when, again, we look at maturation and how different one child is from the next. What we've got to look at is training history. So if we've got a little gymnast who's been doing it since they were 3 and they're now 13, and they've got 10 years of doing those movements under their belt, they'll have all sorts of osseous and skeletal adaptations that make them way more tolerant of load. If we've got somebody who's just started in year 7 and they've never done gymnastics before and they suddenly start flipping themselves over backwards, then their skeleton's not used to that. So they're new to a sport, they're trying out all sorts of things, and they're very, very much more vulnerable to injury. So I think those would probably be my key ones, is think more about training history, about how load tolerant they are. I think growth can upset that load tolerance, but equally we shouldn't demonize it, because some kids just fly through the peak height growth years with ease, especially those that are growing a little bit and steady. What we know is it's not about how much you grow, it's about how fast you grow.
Okay.
So the kid that suddenly shoots up is going to have way more traction on those muscle tendon insertions at the bone where the bone's grown, but there's the delay that Dan spoke of. So I think being kind of treating each child as an individual, considering maturation, not age. And if the child is capable of lifting and they have the competence to lift and they've been training for a while, let them fly.
Wonderful. Great advice. Great advice. Dan, myths that you've heard that you want to dispel. Now's your stage.
I think the strength one was, that was the one I had, the resistance training. But the other one I was thinking of was that you can train children like an adult, and you need to structure the sessions very differently. And it's so much of a myth, more of a bugbear a little bit, but children will, they haven't got such great glycogen stores, so they can't do prolonged periods of exercise, but they need those regular rest breaks as well. I think that's quite important, how we structure those sessions as well. So especially, and then if you've got, I say they've got a 60 to 90 minute session of endurance training, they need the right fuel on board there. So the right sort of fats are really important, because that's the sort of stores that they're going to be using. So when I see them, that I've deep dive into what that child's doing in their football sessions. And the volume of those sessions, and like Andy mentioned earlier, the intensity. So they're working at 10 out of 10, and they've done like a 90 minutes worth of training, and they've constantly been running. An early adolescent age, I question if that's the best way to be training a child at that age, where their bones are slowly maturing. Bones at this age don't like the same load over and over and over again. So we need to really consider how these sessions are being designed. And it comes back to my fundamentals again. A child will come in and I'll give them the best exercises in the world. And if they're being flogged in training 4 days a week, and it's about that communication, it's not to demonize anybody. And I'm always open to chatting with parents and coaches, and I try my hardest to try and bridge that gap. It's not about, I'm in my camp and you're in your camp. It's for the child at the end of the day. How can we keep this child healthy? And most importantly, I suppose my final remark here is that I've always got one eye on their future. I'm always thinking of, yeah, I've got a 13-year-old here, but I want them to be keeping on exercising, loving their sport into their 20s and 30s and 40s. They don't need to be broken when they're 13. They're not going to become an elite athlete at 13. There's the amount of elite athletes that a junior going to be seen is minuscule. So how can you keep this child healthy, loving their sport, and not being broken too early? Yeah.
I think that goes back to something we talked about, which is really stuck in my mind in terms of when that child goes through those changes, that they'll become less powerful, less strong. They'll be wondering why, and that I can imagine is a real put off for them at those times. So having that understanding of what they're going through, and that they can say, okay, now I understand it, that's okay, was likely to keep them more engaged in their sport as well. So having that knowledge and understanding is key for the child, the parents, the coaches, but I think the person at the center of this is the child that should have that knowledge as well.
Yeah, and I think that can get lost sometimes, James. I think in the sessions that people end up talking to the parents, and the child just sits there. Get the child involved, ask them what they're passionate about, what are they worried about, and then you start to really get onto their level, and you can dispel the myths of, you're not, just because you've had about 3 weeks off doesn't mean you're not going to be a very good athlete when you're in your 20s. And it just takes that load off their shoulders. You can see it in their faces as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Angie, Dan, this has been absolutely brilliant, and there's just so much to take away from this. As I say, I'm sure this is going to be one to listen to more than once, and I can't thank you enough for your time. And I'm sure, well, I hope we do get you back on again and maybe talk into some more specific of what we might see in these kids, and how we can help and guide them through these formative years of their lives. So really, really important, and thank you so much for both of your time.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.